In the next part of Mayden's article, he reviews 22 species concepts. I am going to pick out a small subset from that large number. And the subset that I'm picking it out on purpose because it represents the kind of most commonly asserted views of what species are and the ones that are the sort of main contenders for defining species. If you consider the species debate as one that's a kind of competition between these different concepts of species, and where the question would be which of these concepts is the right one or the primary one, which one of these concepts gets species right, then this is a pretty this covers maybe like 80 or 90% of the discussion or more if we just looked at the concepts that are on this slide. Okay, starting with the first of these concepts, the biological species concept. This concept was developed by Ernst Mayr and promoted by him. A sample definition is given here on the slide. A species is a group of interbreeding natural populations that is reproductively isolated from other groups. The basic idea here is that an organism is a member of the same species as another organism if it can reproduce with that organism. So there are a variety of ways of putting this. You can say that it actually interbreeds, but of course we know that that's not going to be actually the case for most organisms that are part of the same species. It's not the case that any given organism, right, interbreeds with all other members of its species. That's extremely rare. But so something like can interbreed or is part of an interbreeding population, and that if an organism doesn't or can't interbreed with another organism, then that's an indication that they're not part of the same species. So there are some advantages of this definition. It seems to capture an idea that's been part of the idea of species for a long time, even going back to the 18th century and Buffon, that one mark of species is that they of individuals being part of the same species is that they can interbreed, and a mark of them not being part of the same species is that they can't interbreed, or that when they interbreed they produce infertile hybrids like the mule from the horse and the donkey. So the basic idea, again, well, I think I've set it up, number of different ways. Another advantage of this definition is it seems to fit with some of what Darwin articulated about how speciation happens, extending into new geographical ranges and then gradually the reproductive apparatus of the founder population, the one that's kind of spread into the new areas, gradually kind of mutates slowly and becomes different enough that the two populations can no longer interbreed, thereby becoming separate species. So this is a classic kind of explanation of how you have different species of birds in the Galapagos Islands. So there's a lot. So these are some things that the definition has going for it. There are also some weaknesses, though. So some weaknesses that Mayden doesn't mention, but that are often mentioned in connection with this, are that there are some counterexamples. So there is this phenomenon known as ring species. Well, there are some species of birds that are this way, using the term species loosely. That around a certain range near the Arctic regions in the northern part of the Earth, there's a species of bird where the birds in one range can interbreed with birds in the next range over, and the birds in that next range over can interbreed with the birds in a third range, but the birds in the first range can't interbreed with birds in the third range. So it seems like by this criterion, birds in the A range are part of the same species as birds in the B range, but they're not part of the, and birds in the B range are part of the same species as birds in the C range, but birds in the A range aren't part of the same species as birds in the C range. So there's a contradiction that emerges there, where we have to say that these organisms are part of the same species, but not part of the same species. And so that's a problem. Another counterexample is that you have cases of temporary reproductive isolation or accidental reproductive isolation, and that alone, there's a question as to whether you should say that those organisms can or cannot interbreed. So being able to interbreed or not is a hard to establish, and it's hard to know exactly what the cutoff point is. It's a vague notion where we say that two organisms can or cannot interbreed. For this reason, that there can be temporary reproductive isolation that later is resolved in such a way that interbreeding is possible again. So these are some sort of standard counterexamples. Two other problems that Mayden does mention is that this concept doesn't seem to apply to asexually reproducing organisms, since they don't technically interbreed. It also is basically difficult to apply across distant spatial and distances in space and time. So when you start asking questions like, an organism today, can it or can't it interbreed with, could or couldn't it interbreed with long distant ancestors that are part of the same species, you can get some puzzling cases. Sort of could be similar to the ring species example that I gave before. But the way that this objection is put by Mayden is that the definition is non-dimensional, meaning it's not it's thought of as applying in specific cases as a way of, like, relatively local context, as a way of discriminating two species that might otherwise be confused with one another. But when you go to apply the definition across all space and time, it's very hard to actually apply it to get clarity about the question of whether or not two organisms are part of the same species. So yeah, I think that's all that I will say about those pros and cons of that concept. The next set of concepts in the list have to do with basically similarity between organisms. So the biological species concept emphasized reproductive isolation. Morphological species concepts, as well as phonetic species concepts, which I'll discuss more of in just a moment, and some of the others on this slide, emphasize similarity. So here are some sample definitions. Species are the smallest groups that are consistently and persistently distinct and distinguishable by ordinary means. So there's a question there about what exactly do you mean by distinct? Second example definition. Species may be defined as the easily recognizable kinds of organisms, and in the case of macroscopic plants and animals, their recognition should rest on simple gross observation, such as any intelligent person can make with the aid only, let us say, of a good hand lens. Okay. A magnifying glass. So there are some good things about this. It does fit the kind of traditional and common sense idea of species. Species are organisms that all have common traits. They look the same, they act the same, and organisms in different species don't look the same and act the same as those in the first. And in fact, there's some research in what is called ethnotaxonomy. I'm not sure if that's exactly ethnobotany, I think, and ethnozoology, but maybe ethnotaxonomy as well. That basically indicates that members of small-scale societies live in a certain geographical area. They tend to classify organisms in very, very similar, almost identical ways to those of trained biologists that go into the area and study organisms. So what that suggests is that species distinctions are available to kind of common observation, at least for the most part. Species distinctions can be recognized just by people paying attention to differences of behavior and differences of physiology in organisms in their environment. And so all of those things, visible characteristics of organisms, observable characteristics of organisms, are part of the morphology of organisms. So if we classify organisms in that way, we're using something like the morphological species concept. Some weaknesses of this definition are that it doesn't necessarily track lineage divergence. Morphological characters can be similar, while species are different. In other words, there can be distinctions sometimes, say, between certain species of insect, where observably there is no observable difference, or unless one looks really closely, or for instance does dissection, one cannot really discern any difference between those two species, but that they actually are different in terms of, say, interbreeding. So that's one problem. Another problem is that due to evolution, the same species can actually change in its characters over time. So if you use the morphological species concept, you'd have to say that that species was actually multiple species over time because its characters had changed. But that seems weird. Maybe we should at least acknowledge the possibility that the same species could have, traits A through F at a certain period in its history, and then later in its history end up with traits A through G, but without F. That should be possible. Theoretically, on the basis of evolutionary theory, we think that it's conceivable. It seems odd to rule out a case where the addition of one trait or the loss of one trait in a lineage means that we have to reclassify that all of the organisms or the population at a certain time in that lineage as a new species from its ancestors. So that's the second weakness. Another species concept that emphasizes similarity is the phonetic species concept. So phonetics is a branch of taxonomy that aimed to, it's also sometimes called numerical taxonomy. In the 1960s and 70s, it was very popular, and it continues to be used today in some microbial biology. The basic idea is that we should get a tally of what traits the organisms we have as kind of data, what traits those organisms have, and then classify organisms based on similarities and differences in those traits. And so the sets of traits are phonetic clusters, and the definition that's given here by Sneath is the species level is that at which distinct phonetic clusters can be observed. So wherever it is that the distinctions in traits, large numbers of distinctions in traits tend to kind of fall out when we're looking at comparing groups of organisms, that's what tells us where the species are. So one of the good things about this is that it is a quantitative method, that defining species phonetically is something that can be done quantitatively. You can have quantitative models. Quantitative models are good because they're clear, they can be evaluated explicitly. But some of the weaknesses are that, again, as with morphological definitions, similarity and dissimilarity doesn't necessarily track lineage divergence. And a lot depends on which traits you've got data about, and some of that, and how that, what answers you get about how organisms should be grouped depend in part on how you distinguish traits and how you measure similarity and difference. So there's room for arbitrariness and there's room for challenge to any particular phonetic classification. Another problem is that, as with the morphological definition, the morphological species concept, we have reason to believe on the basis of evolutionary theory that characters can change over time. So sometimes if you were to use a phonetic taxonomic method and apply that, say, to organisms at multiple time points, so looking at, say, features of organisms in a lineage over 100,000 or 300,000 years, then you may end up classifying organisms that are all in the same lineage and would normally be thought of as the same species. You may end up classifying them as multiple species because they've undergone evolution and they've acquired new traits or lost traits that would put them in different phonetic clusters. So that's a strange result. If you think that species ought to be lineages, then it's strange to think that they would change like that due to those phonetic differences.